Hi, I'm Ted Ransaw. It's customary for a writer or researcher to share their background so people can kind of get a really good grasp, really good understanding of how they think and how that author or researcher put together the information that they share for the world. So I'm going to share with you my origin story. I'd like to begin by sharing with you that I did not have a traditional path that led me to become an academic. I did not receive any academic awards whatsoever other than attendance until my second year of my PhD program. Also, most of the teachers I've had never would believe you if you told them I became a professor. I got here by a series of accidental events. In the predominantly white Catholic junior high school that I attended in junior high, I had a science teacher named Brother Jim. Now, Brother Jim used to belittle me and try to embarrass me frequently in class. But to be fair, I did have several white teachers in Catholic school that were very supportive, but Brother Jim was not one of them. I mention him because I actually learned a lot from him despite the negative feelings I had towards him. So, although I don't have one simple story, it's a series of good and bad experience. Brother Jim is important because he broke the rule that you have to feel that your teacher cares about you in order to learn from them. Well, at least he broke the rule for me. So, Brother Jim could care, or he could have cared less about me. He told me so several times. But for some reason, Brother Jim picked up on the fact that I was interested in Egypt while I was getting dressed for Mass. See, I had been volunteered to be an acolyte in this Catholic school, so most likely as a penance for wasting his time in class. Well, on that particular day, while I was getting dressed, he gave me a book to read that led me to become interested in Egyptology. Now, as a Roman Catholic trained priest, he had religious knowledge about Egypt, and he directed me and encouraged me to study Egyptology for some reason. And at that moment, Catholic school became a bearable nuisance instead of just a punishment. And each page I read about black pharaohs and Egyptian rituals, it animated my spirit and filled my soul, my very soul, with a pride for my race that I hadn't really had before. Going to a white Catholic school where there were only three blacks out of 315, I wasn't necessarily affirmed by my identity. Well, by some miracle, I made it to college at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas a few years later. I chalk it up to an ancient spiritual ancestor that directed a teacher named Mr. Thompson to send me for remedial reading classes in a reading van that came on Tuesdays and Thursdays while I was in or attending that Catholic school. Now, it was there at that Catholic school that I found out I wasn't stupid, and the reason why I wasn't doing well in school was that I was bored. Now, when you're younger, you don't know that you're bored. So, unknown to me or anybody else, the reading tutor had discovered that I had a higher reading level and a higher reading comprehension level than the grade level I was actually in. And so, by going to that reading band, it wound up being a fortunate turn of events because the gentleman who ran the reading van wound up giving me college prep materials that he used for high school students when he came to visit me. So I actually had college prep when I was in junior high school. I got lucky. Now, in my freshman year in college, I had an instructor named Michael Stitt. And Dr. Stick, he had a PhD in, no, wait a minute, he had an MA in folklore, a BA in literature, and a certificate in medieval studies. So yeah, his PhD was in folklore. His master's of art was in folklore, and his bachelor was a certificate in medieval studies. So, like, well, why is it important? Why are his credentials important? Well, Dr. Stitt taught a Viking lit class, and in it, he talked about stories and how they travel around the world. And one story he shared with me, and I still see it clearly in my mind, is that there was a Viking story that had been traced. This Viking story had been traced all the way from Africa to the Netherlands. And so by combining his educational training in folklore and literature, he gave this Viking lit class scholarly linguistic proof that Vikings and Africans had contact. So yes, I'm in a Viking lit class, and a third of the class was about Africa and African images and the connection between some of the African tribes and the Norse gods and the African gods. It was amazingly, it was amazingly fascinating. So interestingly enough, the shipbuilder Thor Heyerdahl, and I'm sorry, never really got good at my Nordic, but Thor Heyerdahl, he constructed a ship made from ancient designs, and he sailed it from Mesopotamia in the Persian Gulf across the Indian Ocean for 5 months to prove that Egypt could have actually crossed the Atlantic. So Dr. Stitt exposed me to that possibility, but he also exposed me to a researcher named Arnold van Gennep, who was a folklorist who researched rites of passage in Norway and Africa. So to make a small connection, this Thor Heyerdahl, he actually sailed a recreated Egyptian ship from Africa all the way across the Indian Ocean to prove that there could have been trade between Africans and people from Norway and Norse, Danes and Denmark, right? So we had confirmation in my class. There was also confirmation in the National Geographic. So going back to Dr. Stitt, he introduced me to a researcher named Arnold van Gennep. And Arnold van Gennep researched rites of passage in both Norway and in Africa. So why is that important? Well, also as an undergraduate, and diverge and come right back, I had a professor named Anthony Ferry. This was also at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and this is where I got my undergrad. And Anthony Ferry wound up being I think his main research area was in communication studies. Yeah, he was in the field, he was in the College of Communication. And Dr. Ferry did research on health communication and the willing suspense of disbelief, right? So trying to get people to suspend their, don't want to say their disbelief, but to get people to do things and see things in a different way. That's basically what the suspense of disbelief, right? So a better way to look at it, there's a guy named Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and he first used the phrase suspense of disbelief in 1817 with the publication of his book Bibliographica Literaria, or biographical sketches of my literary life and opinions. I think that's what the title was. So this willing suspension of disbelief is an altered state of consciousness, and we're going to keep coming back to consciousness. Now, we often suspend our belief in reality and tap into our collective and individual consciousness to learn in ways that are not otherwise possible. Now, this state, willing suspense of disbelief, is arguably an essential element when experiencing any drama or work or fiction. And we'll see how this plays a role into the consciousness and exposing and delving into the collective unconscious. Now, we may know very well that we are watching an actor on a screen or looking at words on a paper when we see a character in our mind. Still, we willfully accept them as real in order to fully experience the story that is being told by the storyteller. So we must believe in fairies, dragons, dwarfs, elves, and even the phoenix to experience the story and to learn the moral that whoever slays the dragon gets to go. So in other words, great risks taken on a journey with friends and sprinkled with just a little bit of luck can have great rewards. So we are willing to temporarily buy into fantastical myth if the frame and structure of the story is presented in a way that we know will have an emotional payoff at the end. But if the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz shows up in a story about the Hobbit, we would immediately reject the entire story and not buy into it at all, even though both stories are fantasy. So, although there's a willing suspense of disbelief, it can only go so far. It has to be bounded in the narrative of the story in order for us to kind of pretend and to buy in what's going on. Now, I also took an experimental psychology class as an undergrad in a class called Nonsense. And Nonsense, the class behind Nonsense was really trying to figure out things or trying to figure out why people believe what they believe or trying to figure out the things that they do believe in and try and make sense from it. So it's nonsense is the cognition behind understanding things that we don't understand. So this class in experimental psychology about nonsense was from Dr. Raymond Moody. And Dr. Raymond Moody is the chair in consciousness studies. Oh, I'm sorry, he was the chair in consciousness studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Now, Dr. Moody has a PhD in philosophy. He has a PhD in psychology. He has a MD and a BA in theater. So if we think about how all of those things add up, you can see how willing suspense of reality may play in a role into understanding nonsense because nonsense actually has a structure, right? So in addition to serving as a chair in consciousness studies and teaching psychology courses, Dr. Moody was also a forensic psychiatrist. Now, forensic psychiatrists intersect the field of psychiatry and criminology and mostly help determine if suspects are capable of standing trial. And although I didn't know it at the time, Raymond Moody coined the phrase near death experience, or NDE. Right. So, how are all of these tying up? Well, Raymond Moody exposed me to the idea that rituals play a big role in the unconscious because we're lifting things from the unconscious. And if you go to a play, it has to believe the play has to be laid out the right way for you to believe it. That's the willing suspense of reality. If you go to a church, things are structured in a way so that things revealed from the very beginning. Like you read some scripture at the beginning, you have a couple of songs, you get into the ritual. It can't be too far outside the bounds of what's going on. And as the music plays and the drama is increased, and whomever the priest says what they're about to say, right around noon, and that's when the sun is coming up behind the stained glass window. This theater, right? All of this plays a role in ritual because if the ritual isn't right, if it doesn't uplift and take things from the unconscious to the conscious, you can't buy into it. So that really plays a role. So the rituals are an essential part of lectures, but especially in Raymond Moody's class. So I remember one lecture combined his medical, psychology, and theater degree into a story he recounted from a Greek priest who used to sit in a psychomentarium. I think that's how you pronounce it. It's a small enclosed area, and the Greek priests used to conduct rituals at the Temple of Delphi before they administer surgery. Okay. Now the Temple of Delphi sits up high on a mountain. Thousands of people travel to hear prophecies by the priestess known as the Oracle of Delphi. You may have heard of that. Well, she would inhale the smell and the scents underneath that mountain, the gases that would come up and enter a trance-like state to make her predictions. Yes, that's right. Dr. Moody was suggesting that Greek doctors inhale mind-altering gases before surgery. Now, remember, way back in the day, these Greek doctors, being a doctor and being a surgeon, psychology, all of these things were kind of interwoven. So the Temple of Delphi sits over a natural gas emitting fissures. But even more interesting, the Temple of Delphi is also known as Isis or Mahalos, if I'm pronouncing that right. And forgive me, my Norse is not very good. Neither is my Greek, but hopefully you get the point. So in class, Dr. Moody taught us a ritual to call the deceased ancestors. Now, you will see how uplifting the unconscious and making things from what you digest below the surface and bringing them up in a ritual format awakens the spirit, uplifts the unconscious, and makes you think about and see things in a different way. The same way we have the willing suspense of reality when we go to a play or when we see a movie. So, like most rituals, the entire service must include the right theme and setting and process to awaken the spirit. And as I mentioned, you can't be watching Star Wars and in the middle of a Star Wars, you'll see a Harry Potter character. You can't disrupt the narrative. It has to be, it has to be right. It has to have all of the elements to it. And you can't mix and match things because people can't buy into it. So a ceremony to to call an ancestor, it has to look right, it has to smell right, it even has the sound right. So it has to walk in, it's got to have curtains, it's got to have some type of smoke, it's got to have the aromatherapy, got to have some wind chimes and some bells, got to have some candles. If it doesn't have that, you can't buy into it, right? So the participants, when they come to call or they come to the medium or the mage to contact an ancestor, the ritual, sometimes they're asked to go and find objects of the deceased that were left behind, and to listen to stories about all those who knew that person who was deceased, um, and ask questions, and that's all part of the process. The participant are also instructed to look into a non-reflective glass, a non-reflective crystal ball or glass at the end to contact the deceased. And so what we learned is if you go and you see this person who's going to help you contact the dead, and it has all the smoke and mirrors, literally, and they say, okay, come, the stars are not aligned. You have to leave and come back in 2 weeks. And that's when the door is open. But while you do that, I want you to go and find something from your grandmother and bring something old, something that people have forgotten about, or find an old brush from your grandmother and ask people how she combed her hair or brushed her hair. And you go in, and so what you're doing over that 2 week period, you're talking to people that knew your grandfather. You're talking to folks that knew your grandmother. You're getting all of these stories. You're finding all of these talismans. And so by the time you come back to have the actual contact with the person of the dead, you spent 2 weeks immersed in the person that you were trying to contact. So every time you go to sleep, dreams are coming up. All of these things are all of these things are happening. So this ritual has to play out in the right role. And when it happens, and when it's done correctly, it uplifts things from the unconscious. So is it actually contacting the dead? Well, if you've gone through all of these things and your mind thinks that you look into a crystal ball that's non-reflective, you can see things, but you can't really see. It kind of brings up things from the unconscious and you project it into this crystal ball or this globe or this mirror. So is it real? It doesn't matter if it's real or not. If your mind thinks it's real, it actually is because your body can't tell the difference. So, in other words, the willing suspense of reality can trick the mind and body into thinking that experience is authentic. So, you may be asking yourself, is it the process of the ritual that brings life to the dead? Ray Rady says that it doesn't matter. The effects on the brain, whether it's real or imagined, is the same. Now, at some point in time, you're thinking, wow, this is a lot of interesting stuff, but bear with me. I'll connect all the dots as we go along. So, also, as an undergraduate, I went to an Egyptian aromatherapy class led by a gentleman called Ray Rady. Now, Raid, as he likes to be called, is the founder of Utadi Oils, and Ray Rady is a Coptic Christian. Right? That's a conversation for another time. But the Coptic Church is an ethno-religious group founded by Saint Mark in 42 AD, who traced their descendants to ancient Egyptians. So we talked about the Catholic Church, but interestingly enough, a lot of what we think of as the origins of Christianity actually started in Ethiopia first before it was in Rome. Now, Ray Rady, being an Egyptian, a descendant of the Egyptian, he can trace his family's involvement in the art of making essential oils for the pharaohs back, like, I don't know how many generations, I forgot. But Rady's seminar learned that Egyptian priests were scholars, architects, science, physicians, as well as aromatherapists and chemists. Can you see the connection between these Egyptian priests and these Greek doctors? So according to Rady, Egyptian priests were the only ones who could read at that time, way back in the day. So they had multiple roles to fulfill, just like the Greek doctors did. So Rady's presentation also included on how to read meaning in hieroglyphics, including mathematical equations and Egyptian symbols. Now, Ray revealed the key to reading hieroglyphics wasn't just connecting the shapes to words, but by recognizing the story behind the figures, right? So you have to buy into the story. So, for example, a deity holding an ankh vertical, that is with the loop pointing straight up, is using the ankh as a shield for protection. Pointing an ankh towards another deity by holding the hoop and holding, by holding it this way, and we're holding the hoop outwards, that's a gift, right? Now, holding it by the loop with the base facing outward means it's being used as a weapon. So even the direction a figure is facing adds clues to a message in Egyptian hieroglyphics, so that changes the meaning. It changes the story. So in a sense, the postures and gestures of the figures in a hieroglyph gives added context to the meaning and intention of the creator of the image. And although the Egyptians did create a written language, symbols combined with images are a sophisticated way to convey meaning and represent actions in the same way that we use icons on desktops, tablets, and cell phones today. So, connecting the dots. While I had many professors in graduate school and undergrad and in my doctoral program, one instructor as an undergrad was especially relevant to my journey that led me to write some of my books, especially Mindful Teaching Practice. So, Dr. Thomas Burkholder, who was in School of Communication at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, introduced me to the African avatar of social consciousness, Allegra, also known as the signifying monkey. Now, Allegra is a character that is found in many cultures around the world. Allegra is known as Isu Allegra in Nigeria, Ichu Allegra in Cuba, Allegra from Benin, so Legba Farm in Benin, the country, Papa Legba in Haiti, Papa Lebas, the Sun Wukong in China, and Sun Hunahan in India. So Allegra is important all the way around the world because he's important to consciousness, because he magically appears and shares with others what is important by connecting the past to the present. Now, while Dr. Burkholder helped me understand the significance of being able to recognize characters that represents the mental process of understanding, what I appreciate most about Dr. Burkholder is that he knew how the lack of African presence in the formation of knowledge negatively affected Blacks in education. So consequently, in one of his lectures, Dr. Burkholder said to everyone, whites and Blacks, "We know that knowledge comes from Africa. The reason why we always talk about the Greeks when it comes to psychology and philosophy and science and mathematics is because the Library of Alexander burned down and most of recorded African knowledge was lost in that fire. So the only other ancient scholarly information that we have written down is written by the Greeks." And I paraphrase that because, that's basically what he said. But in other words, he acknowledges the importance and influence of Africa on the world, especially Egypt, and he explained why there were so many scholarly thoughts by psychology and philosophy that only focused on Greece, and that was extremely important. So I should also add that I participated in a reading group in my doctoral program with a guy named Dr. William Cross. Now, Dr. Cross has a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Psychological Association. He's identified as a Black psychologist. The origin, he's he talks about origin, and he's the one who coined the term negrescence, also known as the African American identity model, which is comprised of 4 stages: pre-encounter, encounter, immersion, internalization, and commitment. And Dr. Cross has been an academic researcher for over 40 years. And so what I learned from Dr. Cross in the reading group that I had with him is that there's a formation of a process of stages. See how things are starting to connect: stages in rituals, stages in plays, stages in things that we read, all tap into this unconscious, this collective unconscious that Carl Jung talks about. So the ability to understand that identity is not a static process but occurs in stages helps me to better understand human development and behavior as a form of authorship and my research. So together, all of these instructors, Dr. Stitt, um, Dr. Moody, Dr. Burkholder, Dr. Cross, and also the guy in the reading van as well, they all taught me directly to tie in my identity as a scholar and directly to my identity as a Black male. So to encapsulate, I see myself similar to Elegbe. And Elegbe has his foot in the past and in the present, and he's always centered, trying to make meaning and trying to connect the dots. So sometimes he says some things backwards to help people understand and make sure they pay attention. And so he has 3 legs. So there's one leg in the past, one leg in the future, and grounded between the two, and everywhere he goes, he drops seeds. Right? So he's always connecting the past to the present. And so Elegbe, what does that look like? Well, if we think about someone who talks backwards and says things strangely and is always caught between the past and the present and trying to make meaning, well, if you can think of Rafiki in The Lion King, who's got the stick, right? He's always talking, oh, don't worry, it's in the past. Always connecting past to present and talking about the future. Also, Merlin. It's another example of Elegbe. Merlin, if you remember, lives in the future but was born in the past, right? That's part of his creation. He's always connecting what's going on with Christianity and connecting back to the indigenous religion that's quote unquote called pagan. That's what Merlin's role was, right? And to finish up with another version of Elegbe is you can think of Master Yoda. So this character is repeated across multiple generations, across multiple centuries. So I see myself not necessarily as an instructor or a teacher. I look at someone who's always trying to connect and make meaning between things that are relevant. So thank you very much for listening to how all of these instructors that I've had in my undergrad, K-12, and graduate career have awakened my consciousness and helped me animate my identity as an instructor and as a researcher who delivers PD content by telling stories and creating meaning in an engaging way.